6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. On today's episode, I'm talking to Hakim Addy all about his brand new book with Alan Lane, African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. Now, this was a really interesting conversation with Hakim. We touched on the origins of African people and their migration into Britain, which of course has a history full of migration. We looked at the role of African people in the medieval and Tudor period of Britain, so what their role was and what they were doing at that time, and trying to correct some misconceptions, and then looking at the journey and developing role of African and Caribbean people and people of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain since the end of the slave system. I know you're going to enjoy this episode. It's really enlightening and really, really fascinating. So I'll leave you with Hakim Addy. So hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. Today we're talking to author and historian Hakim Addy about his brand new book, African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. So I've got my copy here. I've really, really enjoyed reading it. I know you guys are going to enjoy listening to this episode and learning some more. So how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, October's always a busy month, but I'm good. I just come out of another meeting, but I'm fine. Raring to go.
Yeah, well, October's always like that, but I'm glad you've had the time to come onto the podcast. So the first question I want to ask you, and I ask this to every guest who comes on the podcast, what was the inspiration behind wanting to write this book?
Well, that's a difficult question in some ways because I was asked to write the book by the publishers, by Penguin. So that was very nice of them to ask me. But I was really, I suppose I was really inspired by my experience as a teacher. So wanting to present a book that my students could use. And there was a book that was on the same subject that was written about 40 years ago called Staying Power by a guy called Peter Fryer, which is a very well-known book on the subject, but it was 40 years old. And in those 40 years, a lot of new research has been done by many people, including myself. And I thought it was time that we had an up-to-date book which said they covered similar ground, but provided all that latest research and maybe took a slightly different orientation in some places. So that was really what I set out to do, to provide a book for my students and for the general reader that could summarize all the latest research, present it hopefully in a comprehensive way, in a way that's easy to read, and would serve as a reference for people, and would bring the history right up to the present day, or up to 2020. So that's really what inspired me to begin writing it.
I certainly agree that it's a really accessible text, and had I been back in university, this would have 100% been one of my starting places.
Great to hear.
But it's great to see that history can be accessible and there's not that disconnect between academic history and more public forms of history. But one thing that you've mentioned in your book is you chose to refer to Black people as African and Caribbean people. Why did you make this decision in this book?
Because people have a heritage. People have a nationality, first of all. People have a heritage. And it's important to recognize that heritage and not just, present people as a color or as a monolith. Obviously, if we had a history which said a book that was called, if you use any, it's not really a history. There are various ways it could have been entitled, but it's a history of those of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain. And so in a way, it's a British history or a book on British history. Obviously, it has connections with the history of Africa, the history of the Caribbean, and so on. It's also important to recognize that when we talk about the black population of Britain, it's actually made up of these kind of two distinct components. Now, often when people talk about Black British history or whatever term is used, that because of the way the story has been told, and without mentioning a certain ship that's supposed to have arrived in 1948, it's presented in a kind of sort of kind of Caribbean lens, you can say. But if we actually look at that population in Britain at the moment, the majority of the population are actually more closely connected with Africa than they are with the Caribbean. So in a way, there are these kind of two distinct communities. And obviously within the African section, there are people from all sorts of different countries. In the Caribbean section, there are people from many different countries. But just to acknowledge that, yes, there's an important African component that's sometimes forgotten about. And so that's really why I used those two terms to describe this kind of history. And I thought they were more accurate as well. Of course, we also include in the book some people who don't quite fit into either of those two camps. So we have a little bit on African Americans who came to Britain during the period, just because it would be of interest to people. But mainly it deals with those who either came from Africa or the Caribbean or their descendants, their families.
It's a really interesting distinction to make, and to read about the history and separating those two groups. I found it was really interesting to see the different cultural differences and how those groups developed in Britain as well. But looking from prehistory, before even the medieval period, you talk about African people migrating to and living in Britain. Could you let us know a little bit more about this?
Well, everyone migrated to Britain from somewhere. That's the nature of the British, or the nature of Britain, the British Isles, that people all came from somewhere else. Even the book starts, 10,000 years ago with Cheddar Man. And Cheddar Man was a dark-skinned, dark-haired person at a time when everybody in Britain looked like that. And everybody in Europe looked like that. And those people, like Cheddar Man, who inhabited Europe and Britain, they actually came from somewhere else. They traveled. Originally, their ancestors would have come from Africa, but they traveled to Europe and then inhabited Britain. So the book starts off with that, but then it looks at Africans who were here in Roman times, for example, or the possibility that Africans were here even before Roman times, because people traveled around the world. Now, we know about this very ancient history, for example, Roman Britain, from some written evidence, much more archaeological evidence. And so you have, particularly recently, the analysis of skeletons, the use of DNA techniques. And so we know that people like the woman whose skeleton was found in York, who's known as Ivory Bangle Lady, was somebody who was African, who was born in Africa, and so on. And those kinds of scientific techniques are very interesting, because obviously the more skeletons archaeologists test, the more they tend to find that people came from somewhere that they didn't think they came from before. And in the early period, for example, in the 7th century, quite recently, a few months ago, a skeleton of a young girl was analysed near Dover, or near Deal in Kent. And it was found that she had basically DNA that is connected with a population of people who currently are to be found in Nigeria, in West Africa. So she had basically Yoruba DNA. Now, probably she herself didn't come from that part of West Africa. Probably her father or grandfather came from West Africa. Why would somebody come from West Africa to Dover? What were they doing? What were they doing? We don't know that, but we know they were there. And there have been some other tests of skeletal remains from the period of the Black Death, for example, in the 14th century. And again, a lot of these skeletons show probable African ancestry and so on. So this is what the evidence shows us. that people were around. You know, there are even some Roman emperors like Septimius Severus, who also died in York, who came from Africa. You know, was actually born in Libya. There were Roman governors of Britain who were also from Africa. There were soldiers. There were a whole range of people, men, women, and children, who during the Roman period originated from Africa. So the point is that British history is always, or history of Britain has always been like this. People have come, moved around, maybe not in large numbers, maybe sometimes in larger numbers. And that should help us to have a kind of more open-ended idea of what it means to be British. Because after all, you know, the Romans came from somewhere else, the Angles came from somewhere else, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Normans, the Huguenots, everybody came from somewhere else. And that's the quality maybe of being British.
Yeah, it's interesting to see those themes of migration and movement fill in that history. And I do agree with you. Why would someone want to move from anywhere else and go to Dover? I don't I don't see that at all. But you know, moving into medieval period, and you've slightly touched on it. The main historical popular narrative that a lot of people have who haven't really looked at the history, haven't really studied it too much, is that African people who were in Britain in the medieval and Tudor times were enslaved. Is that a misconception?
Yeah, it's definitely a misconception. Some people even say it about Africans who were here in Roman Britain. It's kind of it's looking back in history through, you know, the lens of the 18th century or so. And of course, you know, if we look at the medieval period or even the Tudor period, the relationship between England or between Britain, the British Isles, and Africa was very different in that period to the period afterwards. You know, Africa, we take it in, you know, general terms, was as developed, if not more developed, than Europe. So the idea that Europeans could just, you know, simply go to Africa and enslave people, you know, is a bit ridiculous. And in fact, it was often the other way around, that, you know, people in North Africa would enslave Europeans and so on. But in the 15th century, early 16th century, that equality changed. And, you know, Europe really kind of broke out of its isolation, as it were, out of its backwardness, and went to Africa, not because they thought Africa was backward or poor, but because they thought Africa had all the things which Europe didn't have, like bullion and spices and all these kinds of things. So we have to understand that relationship. And then we find that people came here, people of African heritage came here, particularly in the late 15th, early 16th century, probably from Spain and Portugal mainly. Some of those people would have been or could have been enslaved because Spain and Portugal had begun to kidnap people and began that human trafficking. But many of those who came in Tudor times were skilled people, skilled craftspeople, needle makers, lace makers. Some people we know were property owners. People came because of their skills. They were divers. They were pilots. They were a whole range of occupations existed during that period. And again, in the Tudor period, obviously there were people who were musicians, and we have images of some of them, like John Blank and others. So a range of occupations. And it wasn't until the late 16th century, the period of Elizabeth Tudor, that this England really began to engage in human trafficking. And even then, it was a relatively small scale. It developed much more in the 17th century. But it took until the 18th century until Britain led the world in the human trafficking of African men, women, and children.
And I think you make a really great point there about the cultural development of Africa compared to Europe. There were some fantastically developed civilizations in Africa for millennia, whilst Europe was relatively backwards for a long time throughout that period. But I want to touch on the development of that slave system that you were just mentioning from Elizabeth onwards. What role does Britain and its institutions of power play within the creation and development of that system?
Well, it plays a significant role. I mean, it's to do with the emergence of England as a major European power and then as a major world power, in that period. And it's really the role which you could say human trafficking played in that development. So if you look at the period when England emerged as a major economic power, the period of industrialization and pre-industrialization, so really the 17th century and 18th century, that is also the period of colonial acquisition or colonies abroad in the Caribbean, in North America and India and so on. So Britain's greatness, in inverted commas, is connected with, attacking, invading, enslaving, conquering other people. And within that, human trafficking is key because it enabled Britain to basically develop its colonial possessions, whether in North America or in the Caribbean. And those colonial possessions produced the things which made Britain and other European countries as well wealthy. So bullion, production of sugar, the production of other cash crops like tobacco, indigo, all of those things. And then African labor also provided technical know-how, agricultural know-how, metallurgical know-how. Even some of the developments of the Industrial Revolution itself, metallurgical developments, were actually produced or assisted by the skills that were transferred from Africa and so on. So, of course, the major thing which was produced in that period was, the great wealth which came out of the production of sugar and everything which was engaged in human trafficking. So human trafficking led to the development of the Navy. The Navy led to the development of cotton production, textile production. Textile production led to the great developments of the Industrial Revolution and so on. And human trafficking also led to the development of other forms of manufacturing, metallurgical production and production of liquor and alcohol, which were used in transactions. Everything is stimulated by human trafficking, by the business of human trafficking. And you see the major cities of Europe, of Britain in particular, emerge out of that: Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, and London itself. So you don't find anything that developed during that period which isn't connected with human trafficking. I mean, you going back to Elizabeth Tudor, every single monarch, from Elizabeth Tudor to William IV, all of them were leading human traffickers. Not minor, not did it in their spare time. They were the key people engaged in human trafficking. And the organizations they set up to engage in kidnapping and transporting people were often royal monopolies: the Royal Africa Company, the Royal Adventurers in Africa. And the monarch's family, the brothers of the monarch were the key people engaged in that human trafficking. In fact, when during the period of abolition, or the abolitionist movement at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, William IV stood up in Parliament and said, "What do you mean abolition? Look, this is like our history." And he went through all the monarchs before him. This is our business. How can you be even considering abolition? This is what made Britain great, and so on. So this was the business of Britain during that period. And as I say, every major institution, the Bank of England, the national debt, all the national institutions, everything is connected with human trafficking, empire, and colonialism.
I hadn't realised how many industries had just developed off the back of human trafficking. Those links that you're making of human trafficking, developing the Navy, development of cotton, and so on. It's really interesting to see how interlinked they are, but how crucial the African and Caribbean people were into developing some of those new skills or new technologies.
Yeah, and something like cotton obviously is, even in the 19th century, is slave produced, is produced mainly in the United States by enslaved Africans and their descendants, as well as in other places.
So this abolitionist movement you mentioned with William IV, obviously, as you just said, he's very against it. But how does this abolitionist movement in Britain emerge, and what was the support and opposition to it like?
Well, it emerges. Actually, it's quite interesting because we tend to think of the abolitionist movement emerging in the 18th century, which I suppose is correct. That's when it became a kind of organized movement. But even in the 17th century, you get people who are speaking out against it. And one of the things I try and do in the book a little bit is to give a kind of a little bit of an outline of what I would say is a kind of tradition of anti-racism in Britain, because we often tend to think that everybody was engaged in human trafficking or supported it, and that's often the way things are presented. But in fact, probably the opposite was the case, that there were, key individuals who, even in the early period, 17th century, said, well, what's all this, enslaving people? That can't be right. If you believe that God made everybody in his image, and therefore we're all human beings, we're all God's children, how can you then enslave some people and say some people are inferior to others? This is like blasphemous. This is like an attack on God. If you say some people that he made are inferior to other people he made, I mean, this is a scandalous attack on God and his wisdom and all this kind of thing. So people use lots of different arguments, and for that reason, obviously, the enslavers, the human traffickers, had to develop their ideas, their racism, to try and show that slavery was a good thing, Africans are inferior, Africans not even human, and so on and so on. So we find that, anyway, this abolitionist spirit, anti-racism, even in the earliest period. Then in the 18th century, it develops for a number of reasons. One is that there is a growing concern with rights, with human rights in general. In those days, people said the rights of man, but today we'd say human rights. And again, people questioning, well, then if some people have rights, then everyone should have rights. And so those kinds of issues came up. Then, of course, there was the experience that people in Britain had of actually just being with Africans, because Africans were brought to this country, were bought and sold in this country, were enslaved in this country. People had them as servants and so on. And very often they ran away. They liberated themselves. They just disappeared. And ordinary people would come across Africans in the street and would help them and so on and so forth. Or would intervene when they saw something going on which they thought was not right, somebody being bought and sold, or somebody being badly treated, and so on and so forth. So that is another thing that happened. And there are many examples of, one of the great abolitionists, Granville Sharp, first coming into contact with Africans, literally on the streets of London, and kind of taking his position based on his own experience of helping various people and so on. Then there was the issue that those who ran away often provoked, court cases where the issue of the question was, actually, could people be enslaved? Or did slavery exist in Britain? And that was contested throughout the 18th century. Could you actually say that slavery can exist? Because that had implications for people who were not Africans, who were English as well. So all these things were contested. And then, of course, in the 18th century, you had particularly this idea of rights was further enhanced by the American Revolution, by the demand for independence of the American colonies, and by the struggles that were developing amongst Africans in the Caribbean and so on, and particularly at the end of the century by the struggle that developed in Haiti, in what became Haiti. But here, in the very interesting, in the 1780s, 1790s, you did have this abolitionist movement develop. That people, actually in their millions, signed petitions against human trafficking, stopped consuming sugar in their tea and coffee. It's actually one of the biggest political movements in Britain's history, which hardly anybody talks about. And Africans played a key role in that because, for example, they wrote autobiographies, or they had biographies written about them, or they gave lectures up and down the country. So people actually heard from Africans speaking about their own experiences, saying, yes, we are human, saying, yes, we don't like being enslaved, saying, yes, we don't like, all these being trafficked across the Atlantic and so on. And at a time when people in this country were beginning to think about their own rights and their lack of rights, because generally people had very few rights, certainly political rights, that was something which resonated with people. And so you find at the end of the 18th century, people actually saying that if you're for the rights of Africans, then you must be for the rights of working people here. And if you're for the rights of working people here, then you should be for the rights of Africans too, because rights are indivisible and so on. So that was the movement that developed. It was a broad movement. It also included, people who had religious conviction, people who had all kinds of other ideas about slavery being uneconomic or whatever the situation might be. But a very, very big movement, eventually more or less suppressed by the government, but always there under the surface. And then with the revolution in Haiti at the end of the 18th century, that really made a big impact on the powers that be in this country, because they realized that if they didn't do something, there were likely to be more revolutions in the Caribbean and the whole slave system might collapse. And so they kind of really took measures to try and avoid that possibility. And that's why we have a parliamentary act of abolition in the beginning of the 19th century in 1807. So, but the kind of movement for abolition then of slavery as opposed to human trafficking continued into the 19th century, and was often led by women in this country until, final abolition in 1834. So it's quite a complex and a long movement, but an important one in Britain's history.
It certainly is an important movement, and as you just said, it's very, very little is known about it, and knowing that it's one of the biggest political movements in this country's history is something that should be known about more and by far more people, old and young.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for bringing that to us. Now,
you're welcome.
In the 19th century, and we touched on one of these themes, but democratic reform, religion, Chartism, and revolution play a role in the history of African Caribbean people. And we've touched on a little bit with Haiti and that pressure on the government. How does it continue to play a role throughout the 19th century?
Well, it's interesting that we start with Haiti because the revolution in Haiti was a big kind of inspiration to working people here and people who had sort of democratic instincts. You even find, the great English poet William Wordsworth writing a poem to Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, and a very interesting poem, basically saying that his memory will live forever. He will inspire people forever. So, in other words, people in this country who had very few, if any, democratic rights were inspired by Africans rising up in Haiti, and they continued to struggle for their rights throughout the 19th century. And one of the most important movements was the Chartist movement, which emerged in the 1830s and was a kind of first national working class movement demanding basically the right to vote, and some other rights, but mainly the right to vote and the right to stand in elections. And one of the leaders of that was a man called William Cuffy, who was of Caribbean heritage and origin. He was actually born in Chatham, but his father came from the Caribbean. There were others who were also engaged in kind of radical activities. There was a man called William Davidson, who was part of the Cato Street conspiracy, which was a conspiracy to assassinate the entire cabinet and to produce an uprising, which unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look on it, was thwarted, and Davidson was executed. So there were a variety of people engaged in, people of African and Caribbean heritage engaged in political activity. William Cuffy, one of the most famous, one of the leaders of the London Chartists, was eventually transported to Tasmania. But those struggles for political change, continued throughout the 19th century. And you find others who were, continued to engage in different forms of struggle against racism, against sort of British imperialism at the end of the 19th century. People like Celestine Edwards, who wrote and campaigned, opposed, the so-called scramble for Africa and so on. So those traditions remain throughout the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, you have the beginnings of the Pan-African movement, which united people of African heritage, whether from Africa, the Caribbean, or elsewhere, and was really founded, I suppose, in Britain in the 1890s with the emergence of the African Association. So there's all kinds of fascinating things going on in the 19th century.
And it was really fascinating reading about those in your book and learning about them. And you've made a great segue there at the end of that answer about the formation of African and Caribbean political organisations. And moving into the 20th century, which is in living memory for some people, how are these organisations important in offering resistance to racism, discrimination, oppression, and colonialism?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the features of the 20th century, that we find the emergence of a whole range of organizations, beginning with the African Association in 1897. Often these organizations, or some of them, have a membership mainly of students, people who were brought to this country almost as a consequence of colonial rule. That obviously colonies had been established in the Caribbean, were being established in Africa, and within those colonies, a very small handful of people sometimes were seeking professional employment, professional qualifications as doctors, as lawyers, as engineers, or whatever it was. And because of the way colonial rule worked, higher education wasn't provided. And so people, if they were wealthy enough or able enough to find a way, would find themselves in Britain at the center of the empire. And so then, being at the center of the empire, they often became even more conscious of their colonial status, and the fact that with that came the racism that existed in Britain in the early 20th century, referred to as the color bar, meaning people couldn't easily find somewhere to live, or might be discriminated against, or anyway, in various ways. So people having come from the colonies very often tended to band together, tended to say, well, we've got these common problems. We should get ourselves together and form organizations and groups. So some of them are student organizations, like the West African Students' Union, formed in 1925. And then these organizations, once formed, lobby against colonial rule or demand reforms, campaign against racism, try and organize centers to meet and to discuss things. obviously become connected with organizations here, very often radical organizations here, the left wing of the Labour Party, the Communist Party, others, and so on. And of course, these organizations also maintain their links with Africa, the Caribbean, with the US, and so you get these networks develop during the 1920s, particularly during the 1930s, that stretch all over the world. And just to give an example, West African Students' Union, which was established here in London in 1925, also had branches in West Africa, so in Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Gambia. So if something happened in Lagos, they'd send a telegram to their people here in London and say, look, this has happened. Can you do something about it? The West African Students' Union would get in touch with their friendly MPs, usually in the Labour Party, and there'd be a question in the House of Commons, like the next day. How did they know what happened? So they were very, very efficient, very effective. They had their own journal. They had their own centre in Camden, where you could go and get a meal. They had a restaurant. They would have fundraising, dances. They'd have all kinds of things. So Britain became a kind of centre of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, because you had so many of these students, and other people came as well, just for, and would organise themselves here, and not just in London, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Cardiff, and so on. Because at the same time as you had students, you also had workers coming here, especially seafarers. And many of the oldest black communities are in sort of port cities like Liverpool and Cardiff and Manchester and London. And they would organise as well, because they faced very often more severe problems of racism. There was legislation passed which discriminated against what were called coloured alien seamen, forcing people to register, encouraging discriminatory wage payments and all these kinds of things. So you get these two types of organisation, sometimes working together, existing throughout this period. And that had an influence, as well, as I mentioned, on existing British organisations, whether the Labour Party, the Communist Party, and others, that they became much more aware of what was going on in the colonies. They became much more aware maybe of the issues of racism, that something should be done about it, that maybe there should be laws against it, and so on. So it was a kind of two-way learning experience as a consequence of people being based here and organising here. And it gave rise to some very important conferences, meetings. I suppose the most famous would be the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress, which is one of the most famous of those gatherings. Included important people like Kwame Nkrumah, the future president of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta, the future president of Kenya. Well, they were here in London, or here in Britain. So these people came together, often had very radical ideas, and ideas which influenced people in Africa or in the Caribbean, but also, as I say, would influence organizations and personalities here. So yeah, it's a very interesting and a significant history, I think. And some of these organizations played an even bigger role in Britain. For example, in the 1950s, it was an African organization, the Committee of African Organizations, which was a coalition, which actually launched the anti-apartheid movement in this country in the late 1950s. So a big influence on sort of life in Britain.
And it was interesting to see these groups interact with a wide network of people, like you said, from Africa, with radical political groups such as the Communist Party. And, seeing those interactions, you can really see the influence and the legacy of that today. But one political movement that came out of these organisations was the Black Power movement, which developed in Britain in the mid-20th century and slightly after that. Why did this come about, and what change did it bring about?
Well, I suppose it mainly came about because globally there was the emergence of something called Black Power, or demand for Black Power, meaning really that I suppose that people felt that asking for reforms in things, asking for changes wasn't sufficient. That what was really required was some form of empowerment. That you need to start to make demands and actually bringing about kind of fundamental change in the world, you could say. So that was particularly a phenomenon that emerged in the US, but it also had its ramifications in this country as well. And you had people who generally came out of earlier movements. For example, there's a guy called Obi Egbuna, who was a Nigerian activist, one of the leading Black Power activists in this country, had previously been involved in the Committee for Africa, or African organizations that I mentioned a few moments ago. So yes, these people, these individuals, these organizations were really saying, look, we've had enough of, of racism, of, particularly of racism, of the way that people are treated in the colonies or ex-colonies. We need a kind of fundamental change of things. And so, of course, by this time, we also have much larger numbers of people in this country from Africa and from the Caribbean facing all the problems that people faced in those days. Racism and the colour bar, discrimination in employment, discrimination in schools, the whole issue of ESN schooling, young people being classified as educationally subnormal and put in special schools, colour bar in employment, the fact that people couldn't become, bus drivers or bus conductors or whatever it happened to be. And so the Black Power organizations really demanded radical change. They were often influenced by, obviously, those organizations in the US, like the Black Panthers, or by the teachings of people like Malcolm X. But they applied these ideas to the situation in Britain. The other feature of the Black Power movement globally, including in Britain, was a much greater identification with the struggles of people in what today, I guess, people call the global South. So in Africa, in places like Cuba, in Vietnam, in all these kinds of anti-imperialist struggles that were going on. And so the Black Power organizations like the Black Liberation Front, Black Unity and Freedom Party, and others tended to be formed the latter part of the 1960s and early 1970s. And they were, I suppose, also, influenced by particular events, especially policing. And the way the police were used to attack, Black people, often arrest people on trumped up charges. It was very often the Black organizations, Black Power organizations, that called out, this is what the police force is actually like, way back then. Now everybody says, oh, well, of course it is. Even the police say, well, of course we're racist. Why would we deny it? But in those days, it was denied. The kind of existence of racism was almost denied. And it was these organizations in towns and cities up and down the country that were often the first to articulate the nature of the police and so on. In the book, for example, I mentioned a number of cases, including the Oval Four. The Oval Four case was 4 young men who came out of Oval Tube Station in London and were attacked by a gang of men. It transpired this gang of men were plainclothes police officers. They beat up these 4 young men of Caribbean heritage. Beat them up, arrested them, tortured them. They were charged with all kind of bogus offences and convicted. And some of them served prison term, a couple of years and so on. This was in 1972. one of those young men, Winston True, fought for the next 50 years to clear his name. And it wasn't until 2022, 2021, 22, that he was finally, all of them were exonerated. And it was actually found that the police officer in charge was completely corrupt, had been engaged in a whole range of bogus arrests and cases. And I think actually himself was imprisoned eventually. But the thing about the case was that the police, Metropolitan Police, the judiciary, they must have known about this for decades, but did nothing about it. And it came out accidentally and so on. So you could say that people had, it's quite understandable why people would form radical organizations with radical demands, demanding, massive transformation. As I say, influenced by what was going on in the States, some of them influenced by various forms of Marxism and of, the politics of, Mao's China and all these kinds of things. So that was, and what was happening in the US. So that was that period of the 60s and 70s.
It shows a much stronger response to the racism that was saying being denied by institutions of power and by the public as well, to now a point where racism is more often than not called out upon. Institutions are being held accountable for those actions as well, as you mentioned, that police officer and those group of police officers.
Well, sometimes, not always.
No, not always. No, of course,
not always.
But how does the experience and visibility of this term Black British that you've used in your book, how does the experience and visibility of Black British people change moving into the 21st century?
Well, it changes. I mean, there is this conception of being Black and British. When I was young, that conception didn't exist. No Black person would call themselves British. It's almost insulting to be called, or thought to be insulting. But people would say they came from Nigeria or they came from Jamaica, even if they didn't. Their parents came from these places. But that's how people would identify. But of course, when you have second and third and fourth generations of people here, that changes. And I think that's one of the reasons that people, were here. Their parents were born here. Maybe their grandparents were born here. Was one factor. I think you got the whole development of a kind of Black British culture, if I can call it that, of music, of various kind of institutions, publications. You suddenly had several, Black members of Parliament. You had, various organizational forms. So I think in the 1980s, in particular, 1980s, 1990s, there began to be this new conception that there was something that was peculiarly sort of British and Black culturally that people could identify with and were happy to identify with. And so that has to some extent carried on in the 21st century. I think one of the manifestations of it is a kind of change, as I mentioned earlier, that there are now many more people of African origin. And that's made a little bit of so Black British tends to include those African identities as well. It exists in the language that people use, the words that people use, which have kind of crept into the way that people speak. And yes, I think there is people are, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but people are comfortable with the idea of being Black and British, although at the same time identifying with Africa, with the Caribbean, with other places, so that exists in the 21st century. Although there's obviously there have been some kind of attacks on that. It's been undermined by things like the so-called Windrush scandal, where people who migrated here as children, 50 years ago, now suddenly find they don't have British passports, or even more recently, people who've migrated it, or people who were born here. And then suddenly apply for a British passport and find, well, actually, you're not going to get one because you're not considered British, and so on. So, and I think also by the continuing racism that exists, obviously in regard to the police, obviously in regard to the various incidents that come out. Where are you really from? all these kinds of things that people get asked more often than might be thought. Where are you from? Where are you really from? So there's always a tension there. That racism is there. And, we started off talking about what's going on at Chichester. I mean, that's a good example, really, because, we have a problem in this country with history, in the sense that young people, in particular of African and Caribbean heritage, don't study history, tend not to study history, or get put off studying history because of the Eurocentric way in which it's presented. And so then we recognize that, acknowledge that, establish a course to encourage people to come back, older people to come back and engage with history. Very successful, produced, whatever we produced, 7 PhD students in a few years. And then, the university come along and say, oh, well, we're going to close that down. So, I mean, if you close down a course on the history of Africa and the African diaspora that mainly has Black students, what is that other than, kind of thinly railed racism? And then you use the closure of that course to sack, the first person of African heritage to become a history professor in the country. And then having sacked him, you leave 16 Black postgraduate history students without any supervision, with no plan, with no nothing, and so on. So this is the kind of, racism, you could say, exists, as if, the university does it as if it doesn't matter. And in fact, even break the law, because it seems that they breach the Equality Act and all sorts of other things. But the fact that they act like that and then say, well, really, have we done something wrong? Have we? Oh, no, it's nothing about that. It's all about, whatever, saving money or something. I mean, it's just, but it illustrates the kind of racism, really. You can call it ignorance, you can call it various things, but we should just really call it what it is, the racism that exists. And still exists. And so those kinds of issues make it difficult to be Black and British, or more difficult to be British when you're Black, because you're more likely to get stopped on the street, you're more likely to get stopped driving a car, you're more likely to have poor health care, you're whatever, as well as these other issues relating to, to history, to education, and so on. So, that's kind of the way it is, unfortunately.
It's sad that it is that way, and sometimes I agree, you have to call a spade a spade. If you see something, you have to say what it is. So, you see those events when it comes to sporting matters, every 4 years or every 2 years, it seems to be that there's some massive example of it online, which is just not acceptable in any way, shape or form. Now, we'll move to a slightly lighter tone with a final fun question, as we do for everyone on the podcast. Now, during your career, you've taught, and you've mentioned this in your book as well, you've taught in a wide variety of places. Which has been the most interesting for you to teach at?
Probably prison, I would think. Teaching in prison is always a good experience. I've taught in 3 prisons. The one I taught in most was Broadmoor, which I suppose technically isn't a prison, but actually it is, really. I mean, it's a secure mental hospital, I think is how they describe it, but it really is a prison. In fact, when I went in there, the Crays, or one of the Crays, was there. I can't remember. Anyway, all kinds of people were there. But anyway, I taught a class on African history there. It was really good. The students were very, very good. And I did that for about 6 weeks, I think. So that they were very good. I taught in Manchester, Strange Ways, as it used to be called. I only taught one class there, but that was also very, very good class. In fact, I had I wanted to give a presentation on a flash drive, and the warders wouldn't let me take the flash drive into the prison. They said it was a security risk. They said, you can only bring in a floppy disk. I said, well, it is a floppy disk. They said, no, it isn't. So they said, well, what do you think it is? Anyway, they wouldn't let me take it in. And so I was debating whether I should go ahead or call off the whole, presentation. And we decided to go ahead without anything. And I went into this room. There's like 25, 30 guys there, And so I said to them, well, I want to talk to you about African history, but, I'm not allowed to show you my presentation. So let's just discuss, what I would like you to do is introduce yourselves and, tell everyone what you know about the history of Africa. Well, I tell you, 2 hours later, people were still introducing themselves and talking about this and that. People were so knowledgeable and had, all kinds of stories. It was amazing. It was probably the best class I've ever had, actually. So yeah, that's the answer. Prison.
That sounds like an awesome class to have, and I would have loved to be there to watch that.
I actually was in another prison a couple of years ago. That was also very good. It was near Bristol, I think. I can't remember exactly what it was called. But that was also very good. Yeah.
Sounds like I'm going to have to try and teach in a prison for a few weeks.
No, it's good. Good experience.
Now, obviously, people are going to want to go away and grab a copy of your book, African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History. Where can they grab a copy and where can they interact with you online?
Hopefully, almost anywhere. It should be available in all good bookshops, as I say, in foils, on Amazon. It's now out in paperback. Should be available everywhere. To just go to your local bookshop, order it. You can order it online. You can search it on Google. It should be everywhere. I'm in all kinds of places. Yesterday I was in Cambridge speaking at the university. I'm at Oxford University this week. We did a book launch in Hackney last week. Yeah, just look out for me on social media. I think that's the easiest way of saying it, putting it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's sometimes the easiest. So I'll make sure the link for your book is in the description below, and a link for your social media as well, so people can go away and find them and grab themselves a copy.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much for coming on, Hakim. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Take it easy.
Thank you very much for listening to this newest episode of the History of Jackson podcast. Now, I'm sure you can agree this episode with Hakim was really enlightening and interesting. I learnt so much from Hakim and from his book that I'd never heard of before, and it's really improved my knowledge of British history as a whole. Now, if you guys enjoyed the episode, please do consider heading to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts or the History of Jackson profile for Buy Me a Coffee website in the description below. And if you want to go and support Hakim's campaign, do head to the History Matters campaign that is in the description below. Now, this was a special episode. It was a bonus episode. So on Sunday, we do have another awesome episode lined up for you guys to enjoy. So I will see you all Sunday.